I want to start this episode with a very old story, the parable of the elephant. Here's how it goes. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town. Having never encountered such an animal, their leader, who was also blind, said, "We must inspect it and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So, the team of men walked up to the elephant and felt it. The first person, whose hand landed on the trunk, said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another, whose hand landed and reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fan. As for another person, whose hand was upon its leg, the elephant was like a tree trunk. The blind man who placed his hand upon its side declared, "The elephant is a wall." Another, who felt its tail, described it as a rope. The men began to quarrel about who was right, when a villager, hearing the men, asked what was wrong. The leader explained that they could not agree on the form of this animal, as each man shared their description. The villager responded, "You are right, all of you. The elephant is all of those things," and went on to explain that they were imagining the elephant from different points of view and only from their own experience. What our industry can learn from this is that too often our clients feel like the blind man, depending on the others to help him understand what this elephant, the design and construction of their own space, looks like. If information from our teams feels different or, worse yet, conflicting and disconnected, it leads to an incredibly frustrating experience. We are at a beautiful moment in history right now, where the broader world has never been more aware of the effect of space on their physical and mental well-being. It will take all of us, with open minds and open lines of communication, to help the rest of the world understand what the future of spaces looks like and enable easier decision-making to move forward. I'm Erica Weyenberg, Head of Research and Content at ThinkLab, and your host for this episode of The Learning Objective. The voices you'll hear on today's episode may sound familiar to you. Amanda Schneider is the founder and president of ThinkLab and the host of the popular podcast Design Nerds Anonymous. Meredith Campbell is the applied research strategist at ThinkLab, and when she isn't in the interviewee seat, is also the host of this podcast. What you'll hear next is my interview with Amanda and Meredith after they completed a 6-month research project called a Design Hackathon. Design Hackathons are an iterative research project where we bring the entire design ecosystem together to hack a big, hairy challenge affecting our industry. This year's was all about the future of client decision-making in the built environment. Today's episode is approved for continuing education credit through IDCEC. After listening to today's episode, you'll be able to, first, learn how the customer decision-making process has changed. Second, why decisions on projects for the built environment are taking longer. Third, explore what is escalating their risk anxiety. And lastly, discover 4 mindset shifts to help you succeed in response. Amanda, I'm going to start with you. What did we choose to hack in 2024 and why?
In 2024, we decided to hack the future of customer decision-making. And there's a few key words that are really important to hear. The first one being customer. ThinkLab is known for researching A&D and the ecosystem that surrounds. But I like to think of us as the McKinsey for the built environment. We track a lot of outside industry stats. We're looking at B2B evolution from Gartner and Forrester, and we might even reference some of those stats today. But what we find is while we track those, some of them simply don't apply to this industry. So as we look at our industry specifically, we're hearing things like decisions are just taking longer, and we really wanted to know why. So I'll say different from our typical hackathons that focus on A&D and on this product ecosystem, This year, we went direct to end users from healthcare, hospitality, education, corporate entities. We even brought developers into the fold. And our goal was really to drive a conversation about what's happening in their world. And the result of 6 months of research, including quantitative, qualitative, some in real life events where we brought the whole ecosystem with these clients into the same room to talk about their challenges and hack how we could solve them, is we got to some really incredible insights about what's happening in their world that leads to some opportunities for us to serve them better. That's what we're really excited to share with everyone today.
And you dove into it that this isn't one specific form of research. We cover quantitative, qualitative, generative. I know the very first step in the process was to collect data from the end users and architects and designers and do some comparison and looking at quantifying the changes and where they were felt most intensely. So Meredith, can you share what that initial research revealed, where those biggest challenges and changes were that customers are facing?
When we set out to understand where these challenges or changes were felt most intensely, 86% of end users said, yes, our project process has changed in the last 3 years. So in a pretty recent amount of time. And when we dug into what those changes were, again, we really wanted to start out by just quantifying what's most intensely happening here. And the top 3 changes that they reported compared to 3 years ago were, first, they're more focused on cost. Probably not surprising to anyone here. Number 2, there are more people involved on the project team. And number 3, they want more data to make decisions. So those were the top 3 biggest changes that they really reported feeling the most intensely.
That is fascinating. I know that we also surveyed the whole spectrum of partners here. So when we surveyed that A&D audience about what their perceptions were of their clients, who are the end users, what were their thoughts and were the changes consistent?
We wanted to get that perspective because what's amazing about our A&D partners is they are working with such an aggregate of different types of clients on a regular basis, right? And 95% of the A&D respondents said, I feel like my client's decision-making process has changed. So just in the last 3 years for them, they're feeling this very intensely. So similar to end users, of increased focus on cost was number 1 for both. So both of them said, yes, that is the biggest change in the last 3 years. However, the number 2 change for A&D was that it's taking longer to make decisions. So that was their number 2, which was a little bit different in terms of their perspective of how their client's project process has changed.
I want to dig into that portion of cost because you're saying both sides of the spectrum say we're more focused on cost. There's more people involved in the project team and they want more data to make decisions. And it's also taking longer to make those decisions. Let's unpack what you learned. Let's start off with one of the big changes, which was that there were more people involved, because I think more people means more eyes on things and more difficulty making those consensus decisions. Who are these new people? Meredith, I'm going to come to you first.
Remember, this was the number 2 biggest change that our end users reported, more people involved. But the reason why we're starting with this one is because what Amanda and I found as we went into this research is that this is a tangled ball of wax. So we have to start here really to be able to understand those other 3 challenges that you mentioned. The number 2 biggest change was more people involved on the project team. What we found in our industry is that the average size of an end user's internal project decision-making committee has doubled over the last 5 years. So in just 5 years, their internal decision-making committee has doubled. So that average size is now 5 to 7 people. But it's worth noting that about a third of end users actually said they have more than 8 people on that committee. So as your next question might be, who are these people? Who's being added to this process? What we found was that it wasn't necessarily that there were new roles that were being added, because we thought maybe we would see like different types of roles that were coming to the table. And it wasn't necessarily that. It's just more people added to the decision-making table, if you will. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Number 1 is pretty obvious to most of us, but a lot of the end users refer to this as the Zoom effect because it's easier to have more people at a virtual table. It's more accessible for more people to be there who might not be able to be physically in person. So the Zoom effect was part of this. There were some nuances by vertical, but for the most part, a lot of what we heard was really consistent. Amanda mentioned at the beginning that we did look at this by corporate, by hospitality, by health and wellness, and by higher ed. And some of the things we heard from some of those different verticals for corporate, this is a lot about kind of these no longer a one-size-fits-all approach. And so they're having to bring in additional stakeholders. They're having to look at different regions and understand unique requirements, which naturally just brings more people to the table. For higher ed, one told us very plainly, look, we're complex, we're bureaucratic organizations, we're consensus driven. It works for us, but look, it just takes a lot of time and commitment to be able to get to these decisions. And then for our health and wellness sector, they are bringing in additional specialization. So you think about the fact that they have to have infection prevention, public safety, information services, and others who have to come in because of these highly specialized spaces. So that's one example of how more people are coming to the table. But like I mentioned, decision-making is complex in projects in our industry. And even though we look at stats from outside organizations like Forrester, Gartner, like Amanda mentioned, that B2B buying process versus the project process, they're just different. And so the answer isn't always one thing. And this one scenario, I think, sums this up really well. So this was a scenario given to us by one of our corporate panelists in one of our IRL sessions. And she said, look, here's an example. The project came in over budget. So more approvals are required. So more people get involved. And then because the benchmarks that were originally established no longer apply, feedback is needed to determine what else needs to happen here for these new requirements. And then because of these new requirements, additional specialties have to be consulted. And so it's just a snowball effect. And ultimately, time plus risk equals more people. And speaking of risk, one of the ways that this showed up really loud and clear is we played this game with everyone. If you're familiar with Would You Rather, we present two scenarios, which neither is really ideal, right? And you are forced to pick one, but it gives us a really good idea of where people's heads are at. And just to give you a sense of this risk aversion, we asked the audience during our research, would you rather take sole accountability for the outcome of every decision made this year? Or would you double the size of your decision-making team, but be responsible for getting all of them to consensus? 90% said that they would rather double the size of that decision-making committee than to have to take sole responsibility compared to 10%. So just to give you an idea of how much risk is absorbed that they are sometimes trying to disperse throughout the process.
And I think it's super interesting because half the room in each city was end users, and the rest was the ecosystem that surrounds those end user and projects. So A&D, commercial real estate, we had some GCs, some developers, but it shows how risk averse everyone is. So I think that's a huge message, whether you're a service provider, product provider, is how can we reduce that sense of risk? Because that is a real issue leading to this decision indecision.
It's shocking to think that their decision-making teams have already doubled. And they would say, I would double it all over again because there is a lot of risk there. Our goal in this research was to help our ecosystem to work more efficiently with each other. So given that, let's talk about the mindset shift that it requires for us to drive success with our customers.
The mindset shift that really comes to the surface if you want to succeed in the future of customer decision-making and help reduce friction, get to decisions faster, help with all these people who are now being brought to the table, is we have to start with their process for decision-making. And in fact, that should be the first thing we figure out, and in some cases help them figure out, even before that product or space solution. All of us are passionate about product. All of us are passionate about space because that's the final product. That's the thing that all of us do. But if you don't have a really solid understanding of their process for decision-making, that's where we found so much frustration and so many of these loops of decision indecision can really start to arise. And we'll share some ideas for some really forward-thinking clients and what they're doing later. But I think that's the mindset shift that it requires is while that doesn't really sound super sexy, understand their process for decision-making, that's really an incredibly important place to start to shepherd them through this process and to go alongside them.
Yeah, add understanding my client's decision-making process to the programming phase. As much as I need to understand how they use their space, I need to understand how they make decisions collectively. Amanda, what did the research reveal about why decisions are taking longer?
We've gone through the who, so we know who's involved and what's happening there. But to dive into the why, I think what we heard a lot was real changes to their leadership landscape. And there were changes happening pre-pandemic, but I think we can all agree the pandemic in many ways accelerated change that was already happening. And in some cases, for some sectors, really threw people in a total decision-making loop. To start looking at process innovation, we have to look at pain. So we started with a pain map, really looking at where pain in the decision-making process was. And what we said for all of these sectors is it was the same pain, but felt differently. So where that pain is means there's opportunity. Why decisions are taking longer has a lot to do with where that pain was. In the health and wellness sector, we heard about churn in leadership caused by acquisitions, with some leadership saying they're changing every 18 months. In our higher ed sector, with every leadership change, they talked about brain drain, where we have people leaving that have all of this tribal knowledge. In hospitality, they talked about this intensity that they're feeling in their sector to carpe the diem. There's so many more changes, so many more opportunities, and as everything is reopened, they simply have to move faster. For the corporate sector, we heard one story about a corporation who started out reporting directly to the CEO, then during the pandemic moved over under the CHRO as everything went remote. I believe there was one more stop, and then they landed finally under the CFO, read cost center. Super interesting. And one of my favorite stories about that was one of the participants said, you know what? I grew up in this real estate space. I understand when my product or service partners are giving me data, but my new bosses did not. And so I spend an inordinate amount of my time reframing things so that they can understand it. So to just put that in perspective, as these cost pressures are going up, there's more people because of this risk aversion, as Meredith said, and now you have all this change. So one of the topics that really resonated that a lot of our participants in these live group sessions talked about so much was this idea of managing up. And as we look at clues to help our product and service partners really serve them better, is really thinking about how we gift them simple, easy to understand tools that they can share. Nobody wants to read a 500-word email. Maybe it's a short video. Maybe it's something instead of using traditional industry jargon, it's just a short video that kind of explains the trade-off between two decisions. How do we help our internal champions manage up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in light of what you learned about that why decisions are taking longer, what mindset shift are you hoping to encourage our audience with today?
I love these mindset shifts because we can give you a lot of data, but it doesn't help you if it doesn't help you figure out where to go from there. So I would say this industry has a way things have always been done, and there's good reasons for that. But my biggest challenge for you, based on all of this research that we've done, is make everything an executive summary and make sure that is shareable. I already talked a little bit about managing up, but I think the number one thing that we can do, and probably my number one takeaway out of this research, is how can we enable those internal champions to be the hero? How can we really give them the information they need to champion a decision without overwhelming them? And that could be this executive summary. And I think our industry getting really creative with how we share those things is going to be really important as a mindset shift as well.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that whole concept of succinct and shareable, that's been several hackathons in the making and definitely underscored here this year as well. It's no surprise that inflation has had an impact on everyone. But let's go back to that number one issue that everyone agreed on, which was cost. Meredith, what else did you discover about this increased focus on the cost of projects?
I just want to start out by disappointing everyone that we did not solve for inflation in this design hackathon. But the interesting thing here is that it wasn't just that pricing was high. It was, number one, the unpredictable nature of it. And number two, the fact that it causes extensive rework. So remember, that was the number one challenge both end users and A&D reported in the last 3 years. I don't think that surprises any of us. But I think instead of looking at this as just a moment in time or this is a thing that's going to go away, I think it is an opportunity for us to relook at some of our processes, because I will tell you, Amanda, I feel like you and I both felt like customers already had a mindset shift here about pricing in the project process. And I don't know that some of that had trickled its way down to the project partners yet. These historic figures that many of us have used to estimate year-over-year pricing, they just don't apply right now. One figure from Cushman and Wakefield, they have an office fit-out guide, and it said that building costs are 33% above what they were in 2019. There's another figure from CBRE that we've been quoting that shows that the cost per square foot has effectively doubled just since 2021. And while those are corporate stats, we heard the same thing from every other sector that was a part of this research. So this extensive rework, we played another would you rather game all around pricing. And we said, would you rather know pricing was going to double or have hope that it could fall, but it could also rise? 60% said that they would want to know that pricing was going to double. It's about taking the risk out of it because at least I know the bad news versus having hope that it's going to fall. And this also showed up when we asked their top frustrations when working with their project partners. So they said that their number one frustration with design partners was pricing coming in over budget. And then their number two frustration with their product partners was getting pricing in a timely manner. It just takes so long for me to get the pricing that I need to make decisions. And it even showed up in the data conversation. Remember, one of their top three was need more data to make decisions. And this really bleeds into pricing because when we asked them what kinds of data would most help your decision making, what would help enable you to make decisions better? Number one and number two place were both related to pricing, cost per square foot and ballpark pricing. So they very much view pricing as data, whereas I think in our industry, historically, pricing has been a process. We do this and then we get to the pricing phase. But for them, it's data to make decisions. And they consider that not only data, but the most important data. So this focus on anticipating cost was what we heard loudest from all sectors. And it is definitely giving them their biggest risk anxiety.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just echo that because you were talking about some of those stats were corporate, but I was doing an interview a little bit earlier today with a healthcare entity. And she was echoing some of this pricing frustration. She said, just because I bought it last month doesn't mean I know what my price is going to be for it this month. No other industry operates like we do. We know no one would have designed it this way. But I think from all of the work that we're doing in this hackathon and otherwise, this pricing conversation is hitting a deafening level of something's got to change here. No other industry would operate this way.
Yeah, I think you're right, Amanda.
It goes back to what Meredith said earlier, that it's not even about the product. It's about that process because the rework process is so labor intensive that whatever that X% increase is, you're going to eat it up with all the rework. Or even if it fell, whatever percent that decrease was, you're going to eat it up with all the time it's going to take in labor to redo the drawings, to rebid, to whatever you got to do.
Yeah, absolutely right. So given that we haven't solved for that exactly today, given what you've learned about this cost uncertainty, that's anxiety, and the risk that's in the process inherently, what would be your mindset shift that you would encourage our audience to consider?
Yeah, we had so many good insights from our end users here, and they're very open to trying new things. Many of them are. But what we heard loud and clear is such an opportunity for those of us who support these end users in their project process is that value engineering should be an integral part of the process and not a dirty word. I think oftentimes we hear value engineering and we think stripping away or something was wrong, so we have to redo it. But what we heard really loudly from many of these, some of these are huge brands that we're talking to, and they view your ability to come to the table with value engineering options as just good business, just part of the process. And in fact, that is what they most valued from their best partners, is they view that as the new creativity.
It's proactive and it is creative and hopefully allows for things to move forward. So you heard that pricing was their top data need, as you mentioned. But Amanda, what else did you find out about this need for we need more data to make decisions?
It was really interesting as we dove into what they were looking for, because we heard over and over again, we need more data to make decisions. But what we often found was they had the data. They just lacked this storytelling with data. They didn't know how to turn that data into actions. And some quick stats that came up from some of the quantitative pieces that we did, 96% of end users said that they wanted more data to make these decisions, but 88% said that the data that they received does not meet their needs. So it has to do with this translation. Meredith likes to call it sense making, which is that context synthesis and storytelling. We had the benefit that we did 2 separate surveys. So we get a starting point and then go into the qualitative where we did these deep sessions. And then we did a follow-up, even deeper survey. And that survey confirmed that the top 2 problems with data are that it's too complicated to understand and apply, and it's too hard to prioritize what's important from the data that has been provided. I think while our industry has had benchmarks that have traditionally guided us, things are getting a lot murkier. Those old benchmarks no longer apply. And thus, these leaders are really faced with sometimes conflicting data. And that's leading to some of the indecision that's really challenging.
You really drove home that point of data is here and it's accessible, but what do I do with it? And is it even the right data? So what's the mindset shift we need to move forward with?
The mindset shift is that data is just data. It's storytelling and personalization that are key. So how do we go beyond just saying 75% of people feel this way and really put it into a story that our constituents can understand? As I go back to some of the other mindset shifts we've talked about, like managing up, is how do you even gift it to somebody in a way that it's super, super simple to understand and share? So again, it could be the format that you're sharing it. It could be a short video that's easily forwardable without them having to memorize it and retell it. Or it could be something that is one of these like this, but different stories, right? Like you've heard me say that as we've talked here, we're even adopting these at Think Lab. We're like McKinsey, but different because we specialize for decisions in the built environment. So I think the more that we can think about really leveraging that data, but simplifying it and using it as storytelling. And frankly, that's one thing this industry does best is make it very visual. So how do we storytell with that data, make it visual and personalize it?
And we do love a good visual as a creative industry. But I know that part of the research process was going out to multiple cities. And this was a way for us to brainstorm and get some ideas from the entire ecosystem in physically the same room. What were some of your favorite ideas?
I'll start. There were so many really inspiring ideas, but one of my favorites was shared by one of our panelists in Atlanta. She works for a large corporate end user, and she suggested that her fellow end users and also A&D firms and manufacturers encourage their clients to consider mapping the team. So we all know what an organizational chart is, right? It's showing who's here, who's there, what departments are, who's over who. But what they do before they start a project, as they're mapping out the timeline and the time frame of the project, all of these things, the scope, is they actually create a decision org chart. And in this brilliant document, it is who's involved, who has final say over what, and when these decisions will be made. And it does a couple of things. Number one, it's something they share with their project team. So they know who these people are at different phases of the process who need to be involved. Because as we know, those who are a part of the decision-making committee and those who are making the final decision are often very different levels of involvement. And so this helps everyone be super crystal clear about what those decisions are, who gets to make those decisions, and when they need to be ready to make that decision. Create a decision organizational chart. The second idea that is so simple but so profound, as some of the best ideas often are, came from an A&D firm in our Atlanta session. And this was a lot about enabling that decision making, like Amanda mentioned before, of making things an executive summary. And she said, within their team, they say, does this need to be a spreadsheet or does this need to be a rendering? Because so often we may be delivering something in the method that feels best to us or in the language that we speak, which might be a floor plan or a rendering, but one of the A&D firms shared in a session, I shared a floor plan with an executive the other day, and he didn't even know how to read a floor plan. So meeting people where they are with the decisions they need to make in the formats that make sense to them. If they're the CFO, maybe they love a rendering, but maybe they need a spreadsheet. So really simple, and many of you are already doing this, but just that question, does this need to be a spreadsheet or does this need to be a rendering? And then the third idea I'll share, because we talked so much about pricing, and this came up in every single session. And I think this is something that many companies are already doing. And if they're not, I believe we're going to see this more and more, was really flipping the process. We heard this a lot in higher ed, that they are having a construction manager come in early. Many of them are even bringing estimators on staff. So they have this expertise that's coming in the very early stages to be able to start to establish some budget to protect themselves from some of the risk. But some of the design firms raised their hand and they said, we'd love to be involved in those conversations too. What if we were to come together and have a design charrette and these pricing exercises done at the same time? That way, you're not having champagne taste on a beer budget. You're designing to something that you actually want and you understand the value and where the value lies. And so having those parties come to the table early was something that some of these really forward-thinking clients were willing to rethink some of those typical processes to find a better way that works out all around in a more streamlined fashion. So those are my 3. Amanda, what were some of your favorite?
It's really hard to narrow down to just 3. We did 3 different cities where we brought all these different people together. But I want to build off yours first because I talked about those pain maps. And I would say to anyone listening, if you want to get more on those pain maps, we had a whole mini season of Design Nerds Anonymous, our podcast that dives much deeper by vertical into kind of the same pain felt differently. But the overarching message from that, if we aggregated all these different categories and the nuances by vertical, corporate, education, healthcare, et cetera, is that a lot of the pain was early on. So you talked about bringing in partners early, and I don't think that there's a partner, be it a product or service partner, that wouldn't jump at the chance to get involved early and be an integral part of that process. But what we heard is make sure that you're adding value. Come in early, but know that this is where we're struggling. This is where the pain is. So what value can you add to make sure that we're moving the process forward and you're not just one more warm body absorbing, you're actually adding to the conversation and driving some of those things. So that's one, get in early, but make sure you're adding value. The second one that I want to pull on was something that I've mentioned before, which is really hammering this, enable your internal champion to manage up. I can't understate this because I think that there's so much exploration to be done. I'll use an example at ThinkLab to give some story to this, that we have been leveraging video summaries. What we found is often when we present our full research to clients, synchronously, they're so overwhelmed with being fire hosed with this data, they struggle to respond and ask questions. So we usually end up having to have multiple more meetings to do that. So what we started doing instead is leveraging asynchronous. So we would do a 20-minute summary. These are the 5 key highlights we want you to take in, not fire hosing them, just a key executive summary. Everything's an executive summary, giving that to them in advance. Maybe it's 20 minutes and allowing them to maybe look through the full deck, the full presentation for any of your overachievers that want to do that. And what it allows you to do is then when you get to that Q&A, everyone can come with the questions they have and they're not taking it all in the moment. As we look at that synchronous, asynchronous delivery and enabling your managers to sell up or even share that, there's so much opportunity for experimentation here. There's an opportunity to share some best practices and really figure out how to do that better. And the third one that I'll say is really around this cost. I don't think we can underemphasize also that cost was that number one. And none of us are going to solve for inflation. But I think we all have to be really open to the fact that VE is no longer a bad word and is really critical to get that in early. And let's not go through this whole hoop jumping process if we know that a path we're going down is just going to be a champagne taste on a beer budget. So VE as an integral part of the process would probably be my third idea. Those are some of my favorite ideas.
I think those are fantastic. And I love that it approaches many of the different changes in the process that have been felt. The whole world has changed. So now is the time to make a bold move forward and take that stance and start getting our teams aligned on how we can do that together. So for those of you who want to apply some of these learnings to your project process, what is your advice for what they should do next?
One of the things that you can do if you want to hear more of what you heard today, if you want to have these insights brought to your firm, or if you're an end user, you want your colleagues to be able to hear some of this as well, we will have a CEU that is available through Allsteel, Kielhauer, and Kimball International. So any of those brands, reach out to your rep. They should be able to make sure you get connected with a little bit more comprehensive of what you heard us riff off of today.
And I'll add to that, I would personally invite you to follow Design Nerds Anonymous wherever you get your podcast. And we're excited to share even more applicable insights, not only for you and your company, but that you can share with your clients and your industry partners. It's the end of our research collection phase, but we hope it's just the beginning, because our hope is that you all take this in and leverage it to really drive some meaningful conversations and inspiration and hope for this industry for an even better future.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, I think it provides a little more empathy, no matter which seat you're sitting in, for those who are sitting across the table from you. So I want to personally thank each of you for joining us. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Meredith, for all of the incredible work that you poured into this research. But thank you again from all of us at ThinkLab.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening and learning with us today. A very special thanks to our research partners who made this episode of The Learning Objective possible: Allsteel, Kimball, Kielhauer, and Technion. The Learning Objective is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Special thanks to our production team, Hannah Vitti, Rachel Senator, and Rob Schulte.